There are various verses all over the Quran that talks about the formation of the embryo. One such example is Quran 22:5, where it says, "People, if you doubt the resurrection, that we created you from dust, then a drop of fluid, then a clinging form, then a lump of flesh, both shaped and unshaped, we mean to make our power clear to you. Whatever we choose, we cause to remain in the womb for an appointed time. Then we bring you forth as infants, and then you grow and reach maturity." Quran 23:14 is probably more comprehensive in explaining the stages of the embryo from within the womb. Essentially, the Quranic stages of embryo development are as follows. Number 1, nutfa, translated here as drop, but it actually means sperm, as translated in some versions. The same word nutfa was translated as drop of fluid in the previous Quranic verse, although it is from the same website source. Number 2, alaqa, here translated as clinging form. Sometimes it is translated as a blood clot. Mudgha is number 3, here translated as lump of flesh, but also translated as chewed up flesh. Number 4, izam, which means bones. Number 5, lahm, which means flesh. The multitude of translations and interpretations for the same verses prove that the Quran is not a clear book. Another problem with the Quranic description of the embryo is when it says, "We clothed those bones with flesh." The issue is bone formation or ossification begins long after muscle or flesh has begun to develop. Therefore, there is no scientific basis for the Quranic claim of a stage in which bone is later covered with flesh after the embryo's formation. In the Arabic, the prefix fa before the word khalaqna, then we created, and kasawna, then we clothed, indicates sequential occurrences immediately following an event. Arabic grammar books or associated sources such as this one called Medina Arabic, the link is below, explains the meaning of fa when it is attached to a verb, means that the following noun takes part directly after the preceding noun. Although the Quran indicates the bone is covered with flesh at the final stages of development, and this happens immediately after the bones are formed, modern science says the flesh is formed simultaneously with cartilage, not the bone, as even at 7 weeks there is no bone. The bone is formed only after 8 weeks. In the 10th edition of The Developing Human, on page 349, in opposition to what the Quran says, Dr. Keith Moore, a popular name often cited by Muslims in their apologetics in regards embryology, says that ossification of the bones begins in the 8th week, starting with the upper limbs, followed by the lower limbs and pelvis. Apologists often argue that when the Quran refers to bone, it can also mean the cartilage. However, in this Arabic medical website, it makes a distinction between the bone and cartilage and has different terminologies for both. For cartilage, it uses the word guzruf, a word the Quran does not contain. The website was last updated on November 2022. The title says, "Is cartilage bone?" going on to say azm, bone, and gudruf, cartilage, are not the same thing. Here is the article, both in the original Arabic and English translation. The link is below. It says cartilage differs from bone in that it is less rigid and more flexible, going on to say, despite the many similarities between them in structure and function, however, there are many differences. Even in Arabic dictionaries, such as this popular one called Al-Ma'ani, under the word for bone, azam, it still makes a distinction and uses the word gudruf, cartilage, to say it is the cartilage and its ossification that eventually becomes the bone. Apologists will argue that when the Quran says bone, it means the cartilage, and that is all that matters. A question needs to be asked is, why does another word exist in the Arabic language to mean cartilage if they are the same thing? It seems the Arabic language is evolving and feels the need to add and be more nuanced, whereas the Quran or Allah is rigid and has a more limited vocabulary, to the point apologists have to come to the rescue of the Quran by employing their own interpretation that would otherwise not fit or make sense with modern science. If proponents of Quranic embryology suppose that the Quran was only referring to the precursor cartilage and not the bone itself, the point still remains that the Quran could have easily mentioned the actual word for cartilage, which is gudruf. In any case, the embryology is still wrong, as the muscle of flesh, the cartilage, and their precursors develop contemporaneously, not sequentially, as the Quran suggests. The Quranic scientific miracle advocates consider Quran 2:259 when it talks about a dead donkey brought back to life again. The purpose of citing this verse is because, just like the previously cited embryology verses, it uses the same Arabic word for bones, izam, after which the same verb derivative, clothed, naksuha, is conjugated with the same Arabic word for flesh, lahma, to describe the resurrection of a donkey that had been dead for 100 years. Essentially, the point of highlighting this verse in relation to the embryology verses is twofold. Number one, to show a comparison of how these words, such as izam, bone, and laham, flesh, are used in the Quran in the context of another Quranic verse. Quite clearly, it can be seen the word izam means bone. In this verse, it never gets interpreted or translated as cartilage, which shows that the Quran does mean bone when it uses the word izam. And secondly, to show the contrast of the so-called miracle claims when it comes to embryology and the absurdity of a dead donkey being brought back to life again in the same book. The Quran in 23:14 and 22:5 uses a word called alaqah, shown here in the Arabic. Sometimes it is translated as clinging and other variations. A consensus in the translation say means a clot. An example of 23:14 is shown here. Commentaries will be shown next, which explain that this is the blood stage in the formation of the embryo. In numerous commentaries, alaqa is invariably described as the blood, congealed blood, or simply red clot. For example, Ibn Kathir says alaqa means a red clot like an elongated clot. He then quotes Muhammad's companion Ikramah, who said, "This is blood." Tafsir Jalalain says alaqa means congealed blood. Links to both the commentaries are in the description. Miracle advocates hold on to the word alaqa, incidentally as they do with any other Quranic word or sentence, and try to make out of it something that really isn't there, often by claiming it is scientific and miraculous because it was unknown to the world before the Quran ever mentioned it. The reality is that there is nothing miraculous about the term alaqa as found in the Quran. In fact, the very opposite is true. Firstly, the reason it is described as such is because a clotted dead blood was observed during a miscarriage. So this was an observational phenomenon. Consequently, rather crudely, the formation of the embryo was defined as such in the Quran. Secondly, if the Quran was written by the God of the universe, as Muslims claim, one would have expected him to know that if there was an actual clot stage during the formation of a fetus, this would be a very major medical problem because clots are blood coagulation, which is a mass of blood that forms when platelets, proteins, and cells in the blood stick together. It reduces bleeding when injured and can lead to strokes and heart attacks. This is explained by any medical book or website, as an example of one is here. Amongst ancient Arabs, there was a precedence of the usage of referring to a stage of embryonic development as blood. For example, the Arab poet Al-Nabigha al-Ja'di, who was a contemporary of Muhammad, used the expression in his poetry. For example, in Tafsir al-Qurtubi, in relation to Quran verse 5110, he quotes the poem of Al-Nabigha when he talks about the embryo becoming blood. Curiously, the beginning part of the poem is ominously similar to Quran 59:24, which has the same rhythmic structure and Arabic words. If the evidence just cited was not compelling enough for the Quran miracle seekers, who still insist that the word alaqa or blood clot, which is mentioned in the Quran to be of wondrous and scientific value in relation to embryology, consider the works of Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, who was one of the greatest pre-Islamic poets. His works are cited in this work. His poetry can be found in Hamad al-Rawiya's anthology, the Mu'allaqat, a collection of pre-Islamic poetry. He was one of the most renowned poets that was reputed to have been honored by hanging copies of their works in the Kaaba and Mecca. Within numerous Islamic books, there are accounts that he met Muhammad and that he was the personal favorite of the second caliph and Muhammad's close companion, Umar ibn Khattab. Zuhair's father was also a poet, and his eldest son was also a poet who read his works to Muhammad. Evidence will be shown next, where he uses the word alaqa in his poetry in relation to a fetus. Zuhair's life and poetry is referenced in Al-Iqt al-Farid, written by early Muslim scholar Ibn Abd Rabbih, whose book was so venerated in early Islam that it is considered to be a classic and one of the great books of Islamic civilization. Dr. Isa Buluta, Professor of Islamic and Arabic Studies, translated the book into English. In his introductory statement, he says that the book is an anthology attempting to encompass all that a well-informed person had to know in order to pass in society as a cultured and refined individual. In the original Arabic pictured here, volume 1 of the book on page 245, Zuhair uses the word alaqa in the context of pregnancy, showing that such usage, regardless of its intended meaning, predates the Quran. In the relevant line of Zuhair's poem regarding a journey to see his patron, Harim ibn Sinan, the poem describes how an alaqa or clot was discharged from his camel as it was having a miscarriage on a long journey. Here is a word-for-word translation of the poem. The relevant words read, Yajhudu, miscarrying, min, from, arhamiha, her womb, al-alaq, a clot. Quran chapter 96 is called the chapter of alaq, in other words, the chapter of clot. Verse 2 says, He created man from a clot. The point is, the same word as found in the pre-Islamic poetry is also found in the Quran, both describing the embryo and the fetus. So in conclusion, the various verses all over the Quran about the formation of the embryo being sequential is incorrect. For example, the Quranic description says the bone forms before the flesh has begun to develop. However, the bones do not form for another 7 to 8 weeks. Even if cartilage is being implied, it happens simultaneously with flesh formation. The language of the Quran is defective. It requires modern Arabs to create a new word for cartilage. This is because quite clearly bone and cartilage are different. Whilst apologists are keen to highlight so-called Quranic scientific miracles, the same Quran uses the same words, flesh, clothed, bone, to bring back a dead donkey back to life. The point of highlighting this verse is twofold. Number one, to show a comparison of the words and how it is used in the context of another Quranic verse. And secondly, to show the contrast of the miracle claims for one verse and the absurdity of a dead donkey being brought back to life again in the same book. Crude words such as blood clot was based upon ancient Arabs' observations of miscarriages. There is no blood clot stage in the formation of the embryo. Blood clots are detrimental and formed as a result of coagulation of the blood. There were ancient Arabic poetry that used words such as alaqa and how the embryo is a blood. These are phrases strikingly similar to what later became Quranic verses.